So under the German presidency in 2017, the leaders and health ministers of the G20 highlighted AMR as a prominent topic in their respective declarations. That led, amongst other things, the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research to commit to fund up to 300 million on AMR research until 2028. In parallel, Germany and its G7 and G20 partners kept AMR as a continuous priority on the political agenda all the way through to this year's German G7 presidency. And this is really an achievement, because usually each presidency picks their own topics, and once a presidency ends, these topics go into, like, fade away into the background. And it is a tribute to the importance of AMR that this topic has been carried from presidency to presidency, because there is a strong international recognition of the importance of antimicrobial resistances and the need for new antibiotics. Importantly, in that same line, G7 acknowledged AMR as a shared responsibility and committed to intensifying their activities and taking further urgent and tangible action. This includes the urgent needs to foster innovation and to strengthen the research and development pipeline. So as you probably all know, there's two main angles to this AMR topic. One is antibiotics stewardship, so the very sparing and targeted use of the antibiotics that we have available, and the other one is the development of new antibiotics to combat the rising resistance. Generally speaking, there's a strong conviction in the German government and in the German strategy that international health problems require international solutions. That does not exclude national activities. And so what we do within Germany, there's different levels of funding streams. So there's basic research funding on infectious diseases that is mainly through institutional funding for our main research organizations, such as Max Planck Institutes, Helmholtz Institutes, the German Center for Infectious Research, and the German Research Foundation, which is the main funder of basic research activities in Germany. In addition, there's a national initiative on drug development that puts an emphasis on new anti-infectives to support early stages of drug development. Within this initiative, we also strengthen the collaboration between academia, industry, and regulatory agencies, because we believe that this communication and cooperation from an early stage all the way to the drug development and the clinical stage is key to bringing future drug candidates all the way to the patients. Furthermore, we established 21 junior research groups to strengthen the research landscape in the area of infection research. And 6 of these groups investigate research topics related to AMR. And that is a very encouraging sign, because that means that amongst the next generation of researchers, AMR is a topic that is recognized for its importance, but also its potential to build a career in this area. Aiming to prevent zoonotic spread of antibiotic-resistant pathogens, AMR-related projects are also funded within the Zoonotic Infectious Disease Research Network. So that gives you an idea of the breadth of our national research activities related to this topic. Then the next layer is our international initiatives. We all know, and as I mentioned before, that resistant pathogens no borders, and we need to work together to have a chance to combat that spread. So research and development of novel antibiotic compounds is time consuming and costly, and there is a number of global initiatives that address different stages of this development process. There is the Global AMR R&D Hub, there is JPI-AMR, there's CARB-X, and then there's GARDP. And so let me just outline how these different structures kind of build on each other. It is really necessary in this process to not just fund AMR research and development, but to support it structurally as well. And with this in mind, we support the CARB-X, the Combating Antibiotic Resistance Bacteria Biopharmaceutical Accelerator, it's a bit of a mouthful, and the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership, GARDP, because, and these initiatives are complementary. CARB-X supports product developers in the development of diagnostics and antibacterial preventatives and therapeutics from hit to lead stage up to the phase 1 of clinical development. GARDP mainly addresses the different stages of clinical development up to regulatory approval and availability. As I mentioned before, cooperation and regular exchange are essential to address global health challenges. So with the establishment of the Global Antimicrobial Resistance Research and Development Hub, as a consequence of the agreement under the German G20 presidency in 2017, such a structure for exchange of information and experience was set up. The hub serves as an international overarching forum for information and alignment of R&D priorities, funding instruments, and incentive mechanisms. BMBF has taken the lead in setting up the initiative and in financing the secretariat of the hub. In addition, Germany has joined several other international initiatives on the topic of AMR, such as the Joint Programming Initiative on Antimicrobial Resistance, JPI-AMR. In this initiative, 29 nations and the European Commission are jointly addressing the most pressing issues in research into antibiotic resistance and are promoting multinational research projects. So you see, there's different angles that we support to address this very complex problem, all the way from identifying new compounds to thinking about stewardship and reaching the patients in need. The antibiotic pipeline still needs to be filled with preclinical and clinical candidates against resistant pathogens, especially those from the WHO priority list. In order to achieve this, we need to keep experts in research, motivate and educate young researchers to pursue research and development of new antibacterial products. And we have to keep this topic on the political agenda. In addition, cross-linking of different initiatives could be pursued whenever possible to address the whole value chain of antibiotic research and development. The Federal Ministry of Research and Education will therefore continue to support national programs and international collaborations in the field of AMR. I'm pleased that the Global Health Hub brings together so many different stakeholders to discuss today advances and challenges of research and development in the AMR space, to understand the different needs from basic research to drug development, and also to identify gaps in the global AMR R&D ecosystem. I wish everyone a lively and informative exchange and an exciting discussion. Thank you very much for letting me participate.
Thank you so much, Frau von Messling, for this introduction and for outlining all the ongoing initiatives. I think it's great that you referred to like the political commitment that really has been growing over the past years. also, we are still waiting for the R&D pipeline to fill up a bit more, especially also from my perspective as a clinical doctor, when in the end I'm the one standing in front of the patients and having to tell them that we might not be able to treat them anymore. So really, I'm really interested in now going into a bit more detail with what are the challenges in the R&D pipeline? Is it really more complicated in the field of antimicrobial resistance, and maybe how can we fix it? And I have a really excellent panel full of experts from different sectors that are going to discuss those questions with me right now. So maybe the panelists can turn off their cameras, and I'm going to introduce to you, starting with Gotham, who's a researcher, policy consultant, and medical doctor who works on access to medicines and biomedical R&D policy, and has been working with really a range of international organizations and NGOs. Very much looking forward to hearing from you soon. Then we have Dr. Ishra Singh, who is a research chair on AMR at the University of Liverpool, and who has a background in chemistry. So really the one who is doing the research. He has been working on some new antibiotics like teixobactin, and really hopeful to hear a bit more about like the lessons learned from this later on. Then we have Dr. Jennifer Cohen, who is the Global Access Project leader from GARDP that we heard already of with Prof von Messling. And she's also an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and who has a medical background. And then last but not least, we have Ruxandra Draghia Akli, who is the global head of global public health R&D at the Johnson & Johnson, and who before served as the Director of Health Research for the European Commission. So also a wide range of expertise in the field. Welcome to the four of you, and thank you that you could make it. I have a few questions prepared for you, and then for all the participants, please, if you have any questions, write them down in the chat, and we're going to come back to you later. So at any point when you have any questions, just write in the chat, and we're going to read them out later on. For the start, maybe one question that goes out to all of you, and that would be, from your point of view, really, what are the challenges? What are the most significant barriers in bringing new drugs to the patients? I think you have different points of views to tackle this question, and maybe we can start with this and then go from there.
Thank you, Laura. My name's Diz. Yeah, I think you sent some of the questions around earlier. I think in terms of bringing new antibiotics to patients, well, there are sort of two answers, I think, and probably we'll return to them in a number of times through the discussion. But one thing I think is that the issue in AMR over the last 30 years, as many people on the call probably know, is that the pharmaceutical industry has withdrawn from developing antibiotics. So there's, there used to be 20-something companies with serious candidates in their pipelines in the 80s, and now there's sort of 2 or 3. And the companies that do have early stage candidates, most of them are sort of micro-sized companies or small companies. And the big pharmaceutical companies that have a lot of the capacity and a lot of the capital are not working so much in it. So just to put it in very simple terms, I think that the issue in AMR and the reason that the pipeline is so weak is that the governments of the world have sort of left drug development to big pharma instead of intervening and having a more active role in R&D. And now
unfortunately, we lost this.
Hello.
Yes, you're back.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. So I think the one barrier is that there's been a lack of government role, and they're sort of getting involved. And then the question is, how should they get involved? And the one side is the pull initiatives, which I won't talk so much about because I think we'll return to it. But there's been a lack of a big incentive to enter the market, basically. And the other side that I think isn't mentioned so often is that there's really a lack of public sector drug R&D. And that's something that people have just assumed, well, that's public sector doesn't do that, drug companies do that. But as far as I've seen from working on this for a long time, is that there's no real reason to assume that. That's just something we've come to assume over the last few decades. So now they're slowly getting into the public R&D as well, for example, through GARDP. And I think both of those things are promising to bring new antibiotics to patients.
Thank you. You were mentioning that the big pharma companies are like moving slowly out of the market. Ruxandra, you're working for a really big pharma company. What's your answer to that? Are you moving out as well?
So thank you for the question. It is wonderful to be here today. And I'm actually part of a pharmaceutical company, Johnson & Johnson, that has an effort that is dedicated to global public health. So we are actually an organization where all our research is actually meant to tackle these big global public health issues. And we have seen, for instance, in the global COVID-19 response, this unprecedented degree of collaboration to really smooth and hasten the development of innovative products to bring them to patients. And I think that there is a tremendous opportunity to use that model to replicate those efforts to address the pandemic in the shadows, as they call it, which is the antimicrobial resistance. And we can go and look at the numbers, the recent studies that showed that in 2019, about 1.2 million deaths due to antimicrobial resistance, 3,500 people that are losing their lives every day. So I think that we need to look at it like the preparedness response that we have discussed so much in COVID-19. And to start, I think that everyone pointed out the multiple systemic failures in AMR. So from our perspective, this really includes the lack of early research. We've discussed about academic research. This is where the funding that, at least from the European Union side, knowing very well those activities, have entered in the last 25 years. So how can we maintain that effort will be very important. Then the very high costs and risks that are detailed into the development of new medications and diagnostics. And then obviously at the patient level, the barriers are finding the patients, of diagnostics, and treating patients across all the geographies and economic background. And we are, always told, but the big pharma left that particular research. That's more or less true, because despite the huge societal cost of AMR, there is very little viable market for new antibiotics. And that was an issue that has been discussed for the last 25 years. And look at the pipeline. We've actually tackled the issue of the pipeline. We have now approximately maybe data from the beginning of the year, 43 antibiotics in the current development pipeline compared to 1,000 drugs for cancer. So that's a bit the landscape. So the result is this huge public health need for new antibiotics, but lack of funding for antibiotic R&D, particularly in the later stages of clinical research. And this is creating this multiple hump valley of death, practically. It is a threat which requires action across all sectors. It includes the pharmaceutical industry, but we are actually concerned about this so-called business model, which is non-existent. So one would have to invest, as you all know, billions upon billions in developing a drug that will be put on the highest shelf and used only in a rational manner for just the patients that need it the most. So how we can actually work cross-sectorally for the push and pull mechanisms, but through innovative mechanisms as they have been deployed for COVID-19, and see, can we actually do better than what we have done in the last 25 years? So bringing together this sustained political momentum that
you.
Professor, yes.
But I think you are coming to the end. Okay. Thanks. So Jennifer, you're working in GARDP with government and also with manufacturers. What are the barriers from your side to overcome what Ruxandra called the valley of death?
This is a great question. And again, thank you to the organizers for inviting GARDP to be part of this important panel. I'll just briefly mention 4 major barriers that we see. First is really lack of investment, and Diz already spoke about this, so I'll keep my remarks brief. We have seen the exiting of large pharma from this sector, and we do need both push and pull fundings and probably a diversity and mix of these depending on the drug as well as the market. But I will say we also really need to make sure that these investments and incentives are actually tied to access provisions so that we can really link innovation with real impact across geographies. Second, I'll speak a little bit more about regulatory and study design complexities. So currently, the use of adequate, well-controlled study approaches in a recognized indication has actually expanded our toolkit, and it accelerates the access to new medications for certain geographies. But this also means that we may not actually have the data and guidance on how to use these drugs and treatments optimally for severe infections and for specific populations. For antibiotics for infections, current US FDA and EMA guidance doesn't actually require phase 3 trials focusing on patients with these very resistant pathogens. And thus medications may come to market with only in vitro data, albeit this in vitro data, and there may also be robust PK data, but we may be really lacking some clinical or real world data on how to optimally use that. We can get this through post-regulatory studies, but we really need to double down on those post-regulatory studies as well. In addition, recent FDA guidance, US FDA made guidance, may be actually changing this and require inclusion of more highly resistant infections in phase 3 clinical trials when an acceptable comparator is available. And while this might help to improve better data, it also may make the weight of the clinical trials heavier with more heavier need for recruitment of individuals with highly resistant infections, which increases cost and complexity and calls for further investment. It also calls for strengthening of clinical trial networks in countries and with researchers where these more heavily resistant or highly resistant pathogens exist. So that's another critical area. And then further, to address these and other issues, we must kind of look at innovative trial designs. So platform trials, nested RCT designs may actually help to evaluate not just drugs, but drugs as treatment, and also to look at how, when several options are available, how these options could be ranked or sequenced. So we really need to make sure that these types of trial designs are acceptable to and stringent enough for regulatory bodies. Third, Ruxandra already spoke to market barriers, but just to say that's a critical barrier. And just last, there are implementation issues. So again, products coming to market with inadequate data to support sound clinical use, uneven or weak stewardship programs, and that is across the globe, also in high-income countries, I want to stress. Lack of investment for strong and rigorous introduction and implementation. So we have national action plans on AMR, but these are not funded. They're not monitored. We need to put the same sort of attention globally, from governments to donors to implementers to researchers, on actually making these implementation networks strong in the same way as we've done for things like HIV and TB. Thank you.
Thank you. You spoke a lot about trial quality already, which I think might be a good point to now bring Ishra into the talk as well. From your perspective as a researcher, where do you see the challenges in the game?
Actually, there are many challenges I would start with. So thank you very much, Laura. And thank you very much, Global Hub, for the invitation, as well as have the topic of AMR. And there are many challenges, so I don't know where to start. So let me pick which we face quite a lot. So I see the pipeline, if you look at it as there's a lack of new classes of molecules when you analyze. And that's quite important, from the long-term solution for AMR. And so the current focus, if you look at the pipeline, it looks like it's mostly coming modifications of existing classes. So there is a huge mismatch. So we are trying to deal with 21st century evolved bacteria with 20th century antibiotics. So there is a huge mismatch there. And so why there is this challenge? Because there are not many leads out there, and it's down to the investment further down in the line. So how the let's say clinical and if I go further, I think I see the reasons more like economic failure of the model. So the current model is more you sell, more you based. So it's not based on the value, how much value antibiotics add to the the healthcare. So something on those lines. So till then, I think there is a change. I think it would be difficult to to prioritize the things. And another thing is there is a gap when you go from discovery to preclinical and clinical phase. So how to translate, let's say, innovative idea from discovery phase and bridge it to the phase 1. So there is a big gap there, and it's mostly down to academic universities and SMEs. Sometimes you get it because big players are mostly as already discussed in the beginning, currently not in the the visibility. I know there is an investment, but the most of the focus is modifying the existing one. And so the problem comes, when you modify the existing, let's say, scaffold, it's already familiar to the bacteria. And the resistance problem, come fast. So let's say spending 10 or 12 years of the time, hundreds of millions of, pound of funding. It could be any currency because I'm based in the UK, so I'm giving it in pounds. Okay, so and the resistance problem come through fast. So that's also, I think, one thing is a bit quite challenging one. So from that point, I think innovation in the pipeline is very important to, to support those ideas which are able to, let's say, have potential to address the long-term solution. I mean, modifying existing one can do the short-term solution. That's still good, but still, we need to look beyond.
Yeah, thank you. Now I have a couple of questions from you that come out of our AMR community. They are specific to each of you. I would like to start with Ruxandra. You already said that there is thousands of cancer treatments in the pipeline and only 43 new antimicrobials. I mean, from the clinical side, I kind of see the perspective where we really try to save antimicrobials, especially if they are new, and which might not be the same with cancer treatment. But is that really the main issue, or what are what makes AMR so different from the other areas?
So as I was mentioning, and I think that Ishwar also referred to it, typically these novel antibiotics are reserved to patients that actually failed all the other therapies. So by definition, the number of patients that would receive those antibiotics for which the discovery and the development costs are similar to any other drug, are going to be very, very limited. And I think that the fair comparison would be more like the area of rare diseases with a very limited number of patients, but that have a very high unmet medical need. And we have to be, though, very innovative. We have to look at new mechanisms of action. A good example would be our own work in the treatment of multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis. We've introduced bedaquiline. It was the first new TB drug after 40 years of no new treatment for tuberculosis. And now we are actually trying to build on that legacy, but really look at new mechanism of actions of partnerships, because partnership and collaboration, I think, that are essential in tackling some of these problems. And for instance, we've joined the PAN-TB consortium together with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but also with our colleagues from GSK, from Otsuka, from Evotec, to work on new TB regimens. We in J&J have launched a partnership with the University of Cape Town with a global health discovery center with their holistic drug discovery and development center that would be focused on multi-drug resistant gram-negative bacteria. So I think that taking it from the big problem and trying to find solution for each of the steps throughout this discovery development and bringing it to the patients would be a way to go.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's interesting to comparing it to rare diseases, with the little caveat that it might not stay a rare disease. So then Ishra, I want to come back to you. You have recently participated in developing a new antibiotic for MDR resistant infections. So maybe can you take us a bit into what are your learnings from this process, and would you do it again?
Yeah, sure. I think what we have done so far, I can give you the backgrounds. So we are mostly interested in the MDR, XDR on, pan drug resistant space. I know it's not going to be financially very rewarding in current model, as we have discussed, but the thing is, when, this number of patients come and, they contact and they ask, oh, what we are doing for them, what we can do. And I know, Laura, you might be meeting, things are not working. So that's our focus. So what we have done, I can give you one example for the program, which is based on this new class of antibiotic, tachyobactins. It works by a number of mechanisms to attack the bacteria on multiple fronts, and very high barrier to resistance, so there's no detectable resistance. So what we have done, we have taken that, let's say from drawing board. It's a beautiful natural product. So we have taken from drawing board, can we make a medicine out of it? So it is a part of journey, let's say translating a molecule to medicine. So, and it's usually start with, hundreds of projects, thousands of molecules, and in the end you have one winner going all the way to, the use in the, in the patients. So I would say it's a challenging process in terms, to going from the beginning and making it, because there are a number of challenges comes from having an antibiotic which do wonderful things in vitro is good, but the first valley of death comes, when you go from in vitro to in vivo. So that's where many things, fails. So we have successfully, let's say, crossed that. We have done the scalability while reducing the cost and improving the safety and efficacy. So it's all looked good so far. So, and then we are entering now preclinical phase on that one with a good number of molecules. So with the hope, let's say in 4-year time, we might meet the patients, and in expected timeline for if everything fall in place, let's say in 10-year time, might reach clinic. So it's a challenging process. You have got different disciplines to deal with. So you have chemistry, then you have a pharmacology, and then you need to deal with toxicology. So the three core, strands. So the challenge comes when you deal with, let's say, going from fundamental discovery science to doing something translational. In discovery space, things are still a bit, bordered. Bordered, it means, they are a bit compartmentalized when it comes to funding. Let's say you go for a chemistry focused or biological mechanistic focus or more medical focus. But if you go to the funder and tell, actually, you want to do all three in one, they say, no, that's not a good thing to do. So I would say multidisciplinarity is very good thing, and it's a lot of talk about it, but there's a limited, implementation. But if we can do that, that can minimize the overall time needed for developing this new, antibiotic.
Definitely. And I think that is something that we see with many of those like very big global crises, right? That they actually need a interdisciplinary approach, and currently our funding models are often not yet ready for that. Maybe that's something also to give back to Dr. von Messling, who is
that's why I was thinking. I think it's important to understand that aspect. I mean, something we can do in 3 years. So, but if we do it, 3 different times, that add to 9 years, triple times the budget. So I think there is a potential to, to develop that bit better. That's what.
Thank you also for outlining the timeline and how long it actually takes to get to a final product. I think for me that means I have to save more and shouldn't just wait for the new product to come. Jennifer, you talked a bit already about getting the drugs to the patients, and what we know from a lot of recent analysis is that many of the patients, or the majority of the patients, are actually in global south countries. So how do we reach those patients, and maybe is it also an option to do more of the research there, because that's where we have the patients?
Yeah, I think this is a great point. And whereas we're seeing kind of a map of growing kind of burden for extensively resistant bacteria, especially in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of kind of the burden and the attributable deaths, what we're seeing is almost a reverse map in terms of where products are actually registered and accessible. And so this is a really unacceptable kind of inequality. And even when products actually are registered in these countries that are higher burden, it's often a gap of decades or more. And so at GARDP, we really want to address that gap and shorten it between when we might have access to a product in a US type of country and when we might have access to a higher burden, maybe lower middle income country, ideally to less than 5 years. We want to accelerate that massively. And on top of the barriers that we mentioned earlier, low and middle income countries really do face particular barriers. So there may be lack of surveillance data, as well as lack of region-specific data on the impact of management and treatment choices on patient and health system outcomes. There's lack of data to support kind of use in specific populations or with comorbidities that may be more frequent in low and middle income countries. There are weaker diagnostic systems, unfortunately, and not just the actual kind of tools, diagnostic tools themselves, but also a lack of kind of utilizing that data to develop kind of well understood local antibiograms so that clinicians can have tools both for empiric use as well as tailored or final therapy. Ruxandra spoke earlier to the fact that there's just a lack of market intelligence. There may be very poor forecasting, it's not clear guidelines, and there may be kind of very fragmented markets, and that really kind of hinders even the interest potentially in kind of generic manufacturers in entering these markets. And then finally, I think this is across geographies, but maybe more so when lower and middle income countries are now beginning to develop HTAs. they may be very traditionally based and may not take into consideration some of the aspects that antibiotics may contribute to. So antibiotics underpin that infection itself, but they also underpin our ability to do surgery, to have cancer care, etc. So we really need better data. We need better data to be generated through flexible and innovative trial design that I mentioned, but we need to develop this in concert with trial networks that include as high-level collaborators, researchers, and sites from low and middle-income countries. And we also need to strengthen requirements and support post-regulatory, well-designed studies that can answer some of these critical questions, both globally, but also potentially for populations in low and middle-income countries, especially when we still see a lot of the trials done in high-income countries. And then we also need to really ensure that there's better surveillance, better local antibiogram data, and that antibiogram data is packaged in a way that's regularly updated and understandable by clinicians, including by non-ID specialists. I would say we also need to have incentives specifically designed to meet the priorities of low and middle income countries. So, the WHO's priority pathogen list is an important guidepost, but we will really need additional push and pull mechanisms to ensure that the necessary R&D is carried out, especially as there's not an absolutely perfect match between the pathogens and resistance patterns in a country like the US and other countries, especially in South Asia. And so fundings really should contain sufficient access provisions, including for low and middle income countries. And there may even be things like prizes that specifically are predicated on meeting the target needs or registration in low and middle income countries. Again, strengthening market intelligence and forecasting in low and middle income countries will serve as kind of a market signal. And then we really need to better utilize some of the key tools for access that have been used in places like HIV and TB, but are less used in AMR. Voluntary licensing, pooling demand or procurement to give market signals and increase buying power, strengthening implementation networks so we have good hands that can actually introduce and appropriately use the products and then develop best practices as well as further research questions. And then these can all go into a post-approval research prioritization agenda to support efforts to actually fund and then complete the studies to better optimize these use. And then finally, just strengthen health systems, so actually funding the national action plans and training professionals who are tasked with dealing with infections.
Thank you. We heard a lot of the things that need to be done and the policies, how they need to change. So I'm gonna give it to Diz now, who's a researcher in the area of policy actually, and you have a couple of papers on, for example, reimbursement models in different markets and how we can tackle market failure. What do you think? Can we learn from the experience in different markets? Can we even, or do they differ too much? And what do you think can policy actors do better, probably, to support research and development in this field?
Yeah, so thank you, Laura. We do have a paper on reimbursement models, which means payment models, essentially. And I encourage everyone to have a look. If you Google Gotham antimicrobials, then you'll probably find it. It's not a very academic paper, really. It's more of a policy, brief. So it's quite useful for everyone, I hope. And basically, we looked at what the US, UK, Sweden, Germany, and France have done, or what they haven't done. In terms of changing how they pay for antibiotics. And just to give an extremely short summary, basically the US, Germany, and France have made extremely minimal changes to their payments, which are almost no significant change at all in our analysis. They sort of allow hospitals to pay 30% more sometimes for antibiotics, things like that. It's a bit more detailed in the paper and so on. But in our analysis, America, France, and Germany have not really made an intervention. There's an interesting legislative proposal in America called the Pasteur Act, which would essentially introduce a prize, market entry rewards system. Not sure how likely that is to go through. So that's those three countries. And the country that in our analysis has introduced an interesting new mechanism is the UK. My impression is that this is not very widely known, so I'm just going to tell you about it, even though most people here probably know quite a bit about AMR. And the reason it's not so widely known about is that the UK government doesn't really shout about it and doesn't really, tell everyone about it in a sort of, I don't really know why. I think they should be proud of it, but they're not really putting the word out, even though they're doing something really cool. And so what they're doing is that they've called it a pilot project, and they've said that they'll choose 2 new antibiotics and they will fund them on a subscription basis, which some people call a Netflix model. And basically they will pay £10 million a year for them for up to 10 years. And that will be a set payment. So the companies get that amount regardless of how much it's actually used. And then the companies have to agree to provide as many courses as the health system needs, which could be 100 courses or 1,000 courses, but the subscription payment every year is the same. So in our analysis, that is effectively the same as a market entry reward or a prize. And therefore represents the first large-scale implementation of a market entry reward in the world for anything, and it happens to be for antibiotics. So that's a very interesting and very good initiative in our view, and by our view I mean me and 6 co-authors from the WHO AMR division. And everyone else should imitate it, basically. The UK set the amount of the subscription payment based on what proportion they represent out of the total GDP of G20. So the idea is that if everyone does the same model in G20 based on the proportion of their GDP, then they would together provide an annual incentive of 4 billion per year, which is the more or less consensus estimate for what would be quite good, what would be necessary, or what would at least be quite good to incentivize some antibiotics. So everyone should imitate the UK model. Everyone should implement market entry rewards. Essentially, that's the one thing. And the other thing, just very quickly, which is the other side, is that I have a feeling that even though the market entry rewards are exciting and everyone should do them, they still sort of assume that private industry is a good way to do antibiotic development. They assume that these prizes will incentivize micro or small or even big pharma companies to do some development because they hope to win the prize and so on. And that could be true, but it's a bit of a gamble. And the historical record shows that the private industry approach has not worked. So I think it's quite important to also push on the other end, which is to strengthen public drug development. And just to be very clear, what that would mean is development through to approval. So it's the current paradigm is universities, even if they develop something amazing, they'll essentially develop it at best through phase 1, maybe through phase 1, usually just up to phase 1, and then they will either move it into a spin-off or they will sell the rights to a company. And that can work out, but historically, as I say, it's been quite bad in antibiotics. And I think it's quite worthwhile exploring what would happen if we seriously enable university teams to develop things through phase 3. And obviously that means money. And in some sense, capacity building grants rather than grants specific to a product or a research project, but grants that allow them just to build capacity to do drug development, first, and then funding specific drug projects. So just because that's a less common opinion, I wanted to voice the idea of public sector drug development. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm giving it to Ruxandra with the question of, first of all, what do you think about those kind of reimbursement models, and what could governments, or what else could governments do? And should public development also be more prioritized?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think that Jennifer and Dzintars have, summarized very well what is actually now in the ecosystem. But I think that this new push and pull incentives that can give confidence to the private sector to invest in R&D at the level where it needs to create a robust antimicrobial pipeline are essential. That includes, as it has been mentioned, the hopefully Pasteur Act in the US, the subscription model that has been described, piloted in the UK, transferable exclusivity extensions, which is being discussed in Europe. And in addition to these incentives themselves, it is very important to maintain some regulatory and intellectual property protection for companies that can bring innovation to the market, or for the innovators to bring innovation to the market. We have experienced that with Sirturo, with our bedaquiline compound, and this protection were a key element of our comprehensive strategy to stimulate innovation and ensure access to the new treatment. Then, of course, we've talked a little bit. Jennifer was very eloquent about the valuation of antibiotics, so I'm not going to dwell on to this, but just say that this revised valuation can help signal to investors, that renewed investment in antibiotic R&D will generate returns for shareholders. So that can be a good signal to the market. So as it is happening in the UK and in South Korea. Then we've talked about the reimbursement reforms and the Disarm Act in the United States seeks to address this issue, but making a separate payment to hospitals for qualified antibiotics outside of the bundle payment amount paid for inpatient services. So that's another solution. But to get to the question about how we can stimulate, generally speaking, more publicly funded research, we have to remember that, for instance, in Europe, we have had the Innovative Medicine Initiative, the public-private partnership between the European Commission and FPA, the pharmaceutical industry. The IMR accelerator have had many projects, 8 consortia, over 50 partners. It is a prime example of governmental leadership to really bring this best science to bear. So bringing together the expertise, the ingenuity of the academic investigators with the knowledge of drug development and manufacturing and all those regulatory constraints that actually one needs to bring a new product to the market that is coming from the industry. So we are, for instance, looking very much forward in participating to projects in the context of the new Innovative Health Initiative, where we can again join forces and tackle the issues such as antimicrobial resistance.
Thank you. And we just got a question from the chat that I would introduce at this point, and that was specifically to this now, but links to what Ruxandra just said, and that's about the transferable exclusivity model. So maybe, Des, maybe you can share your view on that before we go further.
Yeah, so the transferable exclusivity model, which is the idea that you would extend the monopoly period for an antibiotic by a number of years, and maybe you could sell that right to other companies, similar to the priority review voucher, if you're familiar with that in the US, the PRV. Essentially, you would discover, your company would discover a new antibiotic, and you'd be awarded this transferable exclusivity, and you would have, if you currently have 5 years in which you have patent rights and market exclusivity and things, then the transferable exclusivity would add a few more years as a reward because your antibiotic is novel and useful. So basically this proposal, I'm not in favor of that proposal. The proposal is based on extending monopolies. The one sort of simple reason why that is not a good proposal is that monopolies in health, you know, are not something we should support and are not helpful. We should try to get away from them as fast as possible. You know, if your monopolies in health mean high prices, they're essentially the by far the main driver of high prices, if not the only driver of high prices and lack of access in the world to various medicines. And we shouldn't use monopoly-based models really as any incentive for anything, in my view. The more sort of nuanced or mechanistic reason why I don't like the exclusivity idea is that it essentially it doesn't really address the market failure very much. It is still saying that you have to make your money back by trying to sell a product which by design is supposed to be procured in small volumes and held in reserve. So it's still saying, you know, even if you have 3 more years of exclusivity or 5 more years or whatever, you still need to, you know, try to sell as much units as you possibly can, which is the exact opposite of delinkage, which is the exact opposite of market entry rewards, which, you know, and the delinkage thing, in my understanding, is more or less a consensus now. You know, my understanding is that the IFPMA AMR fund essentially supports the delinkage and market entry rewards idea. Drive AB, which was the FPA, you know, collaborative project with IMI and the EU, also supports the market entry reward idea. So you know, exclusivities as such are you know, really going away from the market entry reward idea and are in a sense the opposite. So I don't really know why we're moving in that direction. Yeah, that would, I don't know if anyone else has an opinion on the exclusivities for antibiotics. And just to mention also, lastly, in America that has existed for a while. It's called the GAIN Act. And in my understanding, the analysis is that has not really helped incentivize anything because of the mechanistic problems that I mentioned, that you still haven't addressed the underlying problem of you know, antibiotics not being a product which people want to procure in large volumes, and B, there are criticisms that the GAIN Act was not very good at picking out antibiotics that are actually novel and useful, but I'm not an expert on the GAIN Act.
Thank you. It looks like there is more opinions on that because Jennifer raised her hand. So maybe Jennifer, you want to share your view on that as well.
Sure. Just to say, you know, GARDP, we're interested in a number of different incentives, but I think any incentive really needs to be judged not only by, does this incentive actually sufficiently incentivize innovation, novel innovation that actually deals with the public health needs, but also does it result in access, and does it not have negative externalities? So, you know, I think we need to look at a diversity of potential things, but I think from our side, we all are also concerned, will TEE or TEB actually provide sufficient incentives? As it doesn't provide incentives to stay on the market, will it actually result in the impact we're looking for? And there is that concern about some of the negative externalities. So not only for the drug itself, if the exclusivity is chosen to apply to that drug, but also if it's chosen to provide to a more lucrative drug as it's transferable. So I think for those reasons, you know, we're concerned about that. I think we are, you know, open to developing more data, but I think we need to be very cognizant that there are some limitations, serious limitations going in.
Thank you. Jennifer, GARDP is also working in the direction of voluntary licensing agreements. Maybe you can take us down that road a little bit.
Sure. And I also see that Ishwar had his hand up. I didn't know if he wanted to also comment. Sorry if you didn't see it. Do you want me to go first, or do you want?
Ishra, is it on the TEs as well? Then maybe you can go first.
It's okay. I can wait. Jennifer, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So yes, I think voluntary licensing is a very interesting mechanism. It's a way that we can ensure that there are potentially a lower cost licensed product. It's a way that we can also ensure that we are recognizing that some originator or even SME companies may not simply have the market interest nor the footprint to actually ensure that the product is brought to countries that have the highest burden, particularly low and middle income countries. And there may be other companies that may be better fit to do this. So I think voluntary licensing is something we now have are doing for in a collaboration with Shionogi, where we have been given a voluntary license for the medication cefiderocol, again, a medication that is on the WHO essential medicines list. It's US FDA and EMA approved, and it has activity against a number of the WHO priority pathogen list bugs. But unfortunately, we have no access in low and middle income countries, including in the countries that have the highest rates of death due to carbapenem resistant pathogens like Enterobacterales, Pseudomonas, and others. So I would say our goal here is to utilize a voluntary license, which is one important tool, but not the only important tool to ensure that we have access to an important innovation. So it's one way to link innovation and access, but then we still need to look at developing out guidelines, working on appropriate use, and then, looking at pooling procurement, pooling, volumes, providing these market signals, and of course, trying to incentivize the product and kind of use market shaping to bring the product at an affordable price, and so that it is registered and sustainably accessible. So there's a lot of additional things that need to be done, but I think the voluntary license is a critical tool in our toolbox.
Thank you. Yes, I think we're also at the point where we just have to try out different things and see what gives us the greatest success. Ishra, I give it to you. Give your hands up.
Thank you, Laura. I was wondering, what's your opinion? I have this interesting question to all of you. What happened to the knowledge which is available in public domain, could be used to make some useful clinical product, but it's not covered by IP exclusivity? How such, let's say, product could be developed, because I don't know any mechanism at the moment. Any comments from?
I'm so sorry. You were breaking up just a little bit, maybe just for me, so I didn't get the full question. I apologize.
It's okay. My question is, Jennifer, I was wondering if there is knowledge existing in public domain, somebody use it to make a useful clinical product, which has potential to save lives. So how such kind of product could be developed? Because for the current business model, if it is IP protected, there is you can raise the investment and do this, all kind of development. What about if it's not protected?
That's a good question. I can give one example. I think it's not totally what you're asking, but maybe I'll give this example, and I'm curious to see if Diz or Ruxandra have others, or others in the audience can type in the chat. But just to say, GARDP, 2 of the antibiotics in our portfolio are actually off-patent antibiotics, flumoxif and fosfomycin. They are products that we are looking at in combination for neonatal sepsis. So it's really looking at bringing some old drugs to make a new treatment that could be very useful, particularly in this very neglected high need population. Plus, it would be a carbapenem sparing regimen for ESBLs, which I think would be, again, extremely useful, not only for neonates, but potentially for adults. So we'll need to also look at potential carbapenem sparing strategies in adults. But I think what we have to do is, this is another area where this product is off patent, so we don't have the intellectual property barriers potentially for lower cost producers to come into the market. But this also means we really have to double down on ensuring that there is a market and an appropriate market with appropriate use so that a manufacturer will want to come in. So I think it isn't exactly addressing your question, but maybe it's adjacent to your question. And that's, I think, an interesting example.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just come across, while doing this, dealing with some business aspects. So that was the question which was popping up. So
that's great. I mean, that's actually the point of those intersectoral discussions to giving the space for that. I don't know if this or Ruxandra, you want to talk onto that. Otherwise, we have some question also from the audience.
For many years in my many positions in different organizations, be public or private, I always looked at intellectual property, not at the barrier of introduction to anything. So, for instance, in this case, I don't see generic manufacturing. They are rushing to produce these older antibiotics and have or a new antibiotic. Let's say that it's something that is developed by an academic lab and it's off patent, etc., and somebody is making a business model out of it. I think that all our discussion today was more around how do we stimulate innovation, including in these business and access models that would ensure that first that there is a vibrant pipeline, but then that we can bring our new drugs to the patient that need them the most. And I'll give a little bit of a very different perspective on this global momentum to support the research on AMR. And bring as an example the new Amr Action Fund. So this was an activity where 20 leading pharmaceutical companies decided to collectively invest about $1 billion through this AMR Action Fund to bring 2 to 4 new antibiotics to patients by the end of the next decade. So this fund will in fact support clinical research by biotechs of innovative new antibiotics that are addressing the highest priority, those that are listed by the WHO and by the CDC. And we in Johnson & Johnson, we are one of the founding partners. We have committed $100 million to the fund, and we are very proud to see that through investments from the EU, European Investment Fund. Now the AMR Action Fund is the world's largest public-private partnership supporting the development of new antibiotics. So I think that the models are there, but we should continue this dialogue and see how we can improve it.
Thank you. I have another question from the audience to Ishwa, and I would need quite a short response because we're coming to the end. But Ishwa, this proposed to invest more public money to public institutions and universities and to do more of the R&D there. Would that work for your lab? Is that what you're looking for, or would that be too much?
I think that would be very much suitable, and I would definitely support the idea because it's down to, in the end, it's helping the public. So if we go for a subscription model, how people currently pay for the different TV, things, so that could, still rope in that way. So imagine if there's some global organization doing it, and the public sector approach is very much, I would say, viable. But I think for the clinical phases, most of the expertise lies in the big industry at the moment. So I think we need to rope in some expertise from that sector also to make it, let's say, go till phase 1, phase 2, or because phase 3 is the biggest one.
Okay. So for now, phase 3, you still give it to the industry.
Depend upon, if there is definitely a will, how the, if you look at the beginning of antibiotic development, how much government push was there to develop the antibiotic. Go back to, in the beginning and then you see how much, effort was there, investment was there to push the antibiotic forward. So we need something on those lines, and I guess things will change.
Yeah, hopefully. So more money for the public institutions and taking, having them in the game for a bit longer, not just for the pre-clinical. And then there's one, well, it's not a short question, but maybe you can make it a short answer still. You described the UK approach as one thing that you liked, but do you think it also could be scaled up and work on a global level? And if so, how?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that I believe both G7 and G20. I'm just going to focus on those instead of global because it's a smaller number of countries, so it might be easier for them to agree to do something together. But they've both expressed support in principle for looking at doing a market entry reward, and Drive A, which was this report, joint report by EU, IMI, and FPIA, very explicitly, and I believe it was their main recommendation essentially, is that they said that the market entry reward mechanism could initially be piloted by 2 to 3 countries in partnership, and then be expanded to the whole of, to more financing countries. And that's very logical. I mean, like as I mentioned, the way the UK has calculated their prize is based on an assumption that they would be able to get all of G20 to join them. And the last thing I'll say is that often when you talk about delinkage, you're sort of mentioning large numbers, large amounts of money, like 4 billion per year, which scares people a little bit. But the current UK number that they're already spending, which is 10 million pounds per drug per year, is not really a crazily large amount. Especially for novel flagship innovative model. 10 million a year is not a breathtakingly large amount and is quite feasible, and that's scaled based on the UK GDP as part of G20. So that's actually proportional. They're not taking on more than their proportion. That's proportional. Yeah, so I think that's very feasible. And in my understanding, there's essentially consensus that we should do this from a number of high level meetings and multilateral reports. And essentially, you have the one group, UK, and you need, let's say, 2 other countries to join in on it. And I think that's completely realistic to expect that and imagine that. Yeah.
Thank you. And with this, I think we have to unfortunately end this conversation and come to a closing of this panel discussion. Thank you again for participating. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And